Good afternoon or good morning for those of our friends on the West Coast. My name is Dr. Dustin Sachs, Chief Technologist and Senior Director of Programs for the Cyber Risk Collaborative. Really excited to be here. Crazy to think it's already May. Hope those of you who are joining us that were out in San Francisco this past week had a really good RSA event. For those of you who did not go but got to watch all the fun on social media, you're not alone. We all had FOMO, I think, a little bit this week, and we're really excited to be here. Today we're going to be talking about, and we're going to be launching really the topic for the month of May, and that is attack surface management. Today's presentation is Mastering Attack Surface Management, Strategies for Securing the Expanding Digital Frontier. We want to start by thanking our sponsor, Axonius, for this one. It's really great to have sponsors like that who can help us put these events on. For those of you who this is your first time at a Cyber Risk Collaborative, Cyber Risk Alliance event, I want to just share that the Cyber Risk Collaborative exists to be a career development and decision support team for current and future cybersecurity leaders. And we do this through conversations like this, through meetups, through other events, to really provide a vendor and analyst-free environment for cybersecurity leaders. We want you to have open conversations. We want you to share what works at your organizations and what works, what you've seen work in your career, and help others to do the job of security better, quicker, faster, cheaper, all of the things that we look for. We do this through, again, our resources, through our events, through our collaboration and conversation, and this is done on a 24-hour, 7 days a week, 365 days a year basis using things such as Slack, our members portal, our ability to connect individuals together, individuals and organizations. I'll share at the end a little bit of how to get in touch with us if you want to learn more about the memberships that we have. But again, we do all of this in a way to really help current and future cybersecurity leaders actually do the job of security. And the way that we do this is through our resource toolkits, or one of the primary ways is through our resource toolkits. These are 20 topic-specific toolkits full of not only guidance documents, but also tools and templates and resources that have been developed by the community, by our CISO members, by our organizational members, to help do the job of security better. These have been shown to save time, save money, and we've had multiple members even recently come to us and say, this literally came at the perfect time and helped me out, helped me save money when I was dealing with whatever that issue might have been. So if you're interested in learning more about this, there's a URL you can visit that has a spreadsheet that explains all of our resource toolkits. Again, you can also reach out to Tom Ward, whose email I'll show at the end, but it's tom.ward@cyberriskalliance.com. And as we get ready to have this conversation today, I want to encourage you, please ask questions. Please submit questions in the Q&A. Have conversation in the chat. We want this to be really interactive. We want you to come out of this having learned something or gotten your questions answered. Without further ado, I want to introduce our panel. We've got a great panel today. I'm really excited about this. Starting off, we have Nick Bruno, who is CISO and Senior Vice President of IT for SHL. We have Liz Morton, who is Field CISO for Axonius. So, Nick, you want to introduce yourself a little bit more to the audience if they don't know you, and if they don't, that's a shame on them because you are a very well known individual within the Cyber Risk Collaborative, and I'm appreciative for you being here today.
Thanks, Dustin. Appreciative being here as well. And hi, everyone. Nick Bruno, CISO, SVP of IT at SHL, which is a HR SaaS company focused on talent assessment, talent management. Been in security for almost 24 years. Current responsibilities include a lot, which is basically InfoSec, cybersecurity, AppSec, security across the board, but also IT, business systems, and then also DevOps, CloudOps, FinOps. So a lot of different things that basically says I can't say no to anything. So
Absolutely. Well, thank you for being here. And then Liz, please introduce yourself to the audience.
Certainly. Thank you for that. And I'm actually in San Francisco at the tail end of the RSA conference, so my voice is a little in and out. I'm the field CISO for Axonius. Prior to Axonius, I spent roughly 28 years in a combination of, hands-on engineer, leadership roles in IT and cyber. My most recent gig prior to Axonius, prior to being a field CISO rather for Axonius, I ran cybersecurity for Intercontinental Exchange. They're a financial services company based in Atlanta.
Awesome. Well, thank you again for being here. And again, thank you, Axonius, for sponsoring today. So to set the stage for what we're going to talk about, we look at things that have happened over the last 5, 6, 7 years. And really, we talk all the time about the shift and the things that occurred as a result of the pandemic, but also, as a result of just the move to remote work and the sudden move to remote work. And I think attack surface management, at least when I was thinking through this issue, this is one of those areas that gets overlooked, unfortunately, but is probably the biggest, has had the biggest impact because of the pandemic. And, traditionally, 7, 8, 9, 10 years ago, you would think of your attack surface and you would go, okay, it's everything that's within the four walls of my offices, wherever those offices may be. And when you leave the office, the attack surface doesn't go with you. Nowadays, with the move to mobile devices, the move to remote work, the fact that you can work from anywhere or most anywhere, you don't have to necessarily, in many cases, be on a traditional VPN. You can work from home or Starbucks or a hotel in San Francisco. That makes the attack surface more complex, more vulnerable, because the amount of control you have is sometimes less. You can't force necessarily people at their home to do things to keep their routers updated. Many of people probably have no idea how to update their home routers. And that's, and even if they did, keeping a watch on that, making sure that you can, causes all kinds of issues. So, Liz, when you look at this, especially having been, a practitioner, being in the role that you're in now, what are the things that stick out most to you about the way in which organizations and security leaders address, are looking at the attack surface?
I think it comes down to variability. That's the thing that sticks out most primarily in my mind. There's not one surface management. Just in general, I think every company has to look at their attack surface a bit like they look at their risk profile, in that it's different for everyone. Companies that have a totally remote workforce, for instance, I work for a company where we have employees all over working remotely. We use things like zero trust agents to direct traffic for our more sensitive systems internally. But in some companies, there's not quite a risk profile that requires that level of attention. And then in some companies, I worked for one previously, there was absolutely no access to internal systems unless you were VPNing in. So I think in general, we are trying as an industry to find a best practice that works for everyone, but that may not actually be the story.
Yeah, and Nick, as somebody who works for a company that is heavy into the SaaS, the software as a service space, what are some of the parts of the attack surface that organizations maybe don't think about that they should be thinking about when it comes to your attacks, defining your attack surface? Traditionally we've said desktop, laptop, maybe servers, if we consider a server an endpoint, which has always been an interesting conversation to have with organizations who will say, nope, servers aren't endpoints. And you go, well, yeah, they are. But outside of those like traditional, easy to identify things, what are some of the other areas of the attack surface that organizations should be thinking about.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you take a look at like layers, I mean, you have the data layer, application layer, host layer, network layer. Yes, it's physical, it's people layer too. I mean, all that has a surface that can be attacked. I mean, I was on my flight from Atlanta to Boston last night, connected the entire time, looking at email, and half of it was phishing. So again, the people are constantly being hit. All the layers are constantly being hit. The data is being constantly hit, or potentially constantly hit if you allow it to be and whatnot. But everything pretty much has a surface that can be attacked.
Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit more. I think you and I talked about this in advance of this call of like, okay, yeah, we're sitting here saying everything is part of the attack surface, but how can you, focus on that and truly deal with it in a way that is going to be efficient, effective, and allow you to actually get stuff done. We'll talk a little bit about that here in a little bit, but Liz, what are some of the trends or the things that you've seen over the last couple of years, especially in this pandemic and then post-pandemic era that we live in, that have stood out as areas where organizations will come to you and say, "Hey, we're struggling with attack surface management." Where are those areas that you're seeing, or that you're seeing the most risk existing?
Okay, I would say, first of all, working as a field CISO for Axoni is the first thing that customers generally say whenever they want to address their attack surface with us is that visibility is key. We still have this sort of systemic issue in our industry, whether you're in tech or in IT or in cyber. There's still a visibility issue that has been with us forever. Visibility is kind of a fancy word for knowing what you got, right? The old trope about how you can't secure what you can't see, that is still alive and well. But I think, to Nick's point, the attack surface has, at least in terms of how we refer to the attack surface, it has become very variable. So non-human identities are a big topic these days, but that's just the latest iteration of identities being a topic. Nick referred to business email compromise. That is still a vector of great risk. In general, I think when people come to Axonius, they're getting to a point where they're like, "Hey, we've got to put some kind of lasso around our environment. We kind of gotta have to know, what do we have in terms of software, in terms of SaaS, in terms of containers, in terms of cloud, in terms of on-prem data centers, laptops, desktops, tablets, phones." You see where I'm going with this? Like, it is the variability not just of the various security postures that our customers want to achieve, but also the sheer volume of asset types that they have to keep track of. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. And Nick, one of the things that I've heard both of you talk about, and I'm gonna jump to the first of all, what I'll call the elephant in the room questions, which is, you know, when we talk about this idea of you need to know, you got to know what's out there. There's some element of unknown. We know that there is some unknown amount of items that we have on our attack in our attack surface that we just don't know about. How do you go to leadership and say, "Hey, we want to figure out all the things we know that there's some unknowable amount of items we don't out there that we should have visibility into." How do you go to leadership and say, "Hey, I need buy-in. I need you to give me budget to go find stuff that I don't know if I've got 5 devices. I don't know if I've got 500 devices or 500 assets that I need to find."
Well, talk about the risk to the company. I mean, I think when you take a look at what's going to hurt the company from a brand, from a reputation, from a financial standpoint, and how the not knowing where information is or not knowing where assets is impacts that. And is it just because we want to know, or is there an actual material risk there that could actually impact the business in the longevity standpoint? So I think that when you go to leadership and you're really presenting a case around why you need to have something to identify and get visibility into, as Liz mentioned, knowing what's out there. I mean, one of the hardest things to take a look at any framework that's ever existed. First thing to do is understand what your inventory is. What's the hardest thing to know? What your inventory is across the entire landscape. So I mean, when you go to leadership and you start to talk about this, talk about it in a risk in the language that they actually would understand. That's actually going to help talk about the risk and how you're actually protecting the company and also the longevity of the company and shareholders, stakeholders, anybody else that's going to be included in this that actually would have an interest. Don't go there saying I need a tool. And I think that's the biggest thing is you have to put into their language where they're going to understand and can relate.
So Liz, when you're talking with organizations or in your experience, are there best practices or are there like recommendations for the way in which the attack surface should be classified, the way that assets should be prioritized? Let's assume for a moment we know we have a good inventory or we have a decent inventory of our assets. Is there a way, what are the ways to classify, to start prioritizing, to really start figuring out how to address the attack surface and how to define those risks?
Sure, and that's the name of the game largely because you're talking about resource management. The proverbial 5-pound bucket doesn't get bigger, right? No matter how many people you have on your team, you still have more work than you can accomplish. So prioritization becomes the key. So to prioritize, you have to know what's important. Know what's important. Yes, you need to know what you have, but you also need to do an assessment of your risk profile as well as your revenue generation. If you're a software company and most of your say cloud is serving up a customer application that is a direct revenue generator, you might call that something, and if you'll excuse the term, it's not my favorite, you might call those your crown jewels. Whereas you look at your dev environment that maybe is sitting in your data center as a secondary environment, a lower environment. It's not a revenue generator. It's not less of a risk from a cyber perspective, right? We still need to secure that attack surface, but in terms of prioritization, we're going to put that as number 2. So in a practical way of thinking about how you prioritize the work, it can become, you can either look at it like opportunistically. I enjoy a little opportunistic achievement. If you have a lower environment and you have some automation that will do some automated remediation of vulnerabilities, automated patching, automated updates, etc., I think it's just fair enough to tell your devs, hey, we're going to take a window in an easy, kind of an easy time for us to get this work done. We're going to automate this remediation. We're going to take care of this environment, no problem, because that's cheap and easy for us. And, obviously we get agreement and the devs will, of course, see it our way with some winning of hearts and minds. But for your production environment, your revenue generator, excuse me, there's my voice going out again. You definitely have to be much more cognizant of uptime, right? Availability is key when you're trying to make money. If a system's not there, it's not going to make any money. If you don't have money, you don't have a company. You can't pay your people. You don't have a staff. That's a big problem. So I think the handling becomes very different based on, sort of what your systems are doing and the context in which they are doing that.
Absolutely. And by the way, for those of you who are playing webinar bingo, she said crown jewels, so you can mark that all from your
hate it. I'm sorry.
bingo board. No, it's okay. It's okay. Hey, you know what? We've got people playing webinar bingo. They needed that one probably to start off.
Okay, I'm glad I could help them.
So you could actually have people just kind of put in the chat what are the other phrases they'd like to refer to instead of the crown jewels.
Yeah, that's a great one. I'd love to hear what. Yeah, I'd love to hear what people think we should call it instead of crown jewels. I'd love to hear the ideas. Nick, one of the things that Liz kind of mentioned is this idea of having to win hearts and minds, having to kind of build the relationships. So, assuming for a moment that you've got the visibility that you need or that you're looking for, you're asking in order to control, in order to defend or protect the attack surface. Oftentimes, almost always security is not going to have keys to allow them to make the changes that need to be made or implement the strategies. How do you handle that? We've got visibility into an issue, but we don't control the ability to fix it. How do you balance that, and how do you actually work with the appropriate teams to get them to actually prioritize your ask when they've got 5 other asks as well?
No, it's a love-hate relationship. It's give take, whichever way you want to take a look at it. It's it's what's in it for them, and how is resolving an issue that they may or may not understand what the actual risk is to the company, to customers, so on and so on. They only see it in their own little world, and that's all they're focused on. They're very hyper focused on what they're trying to do and whatnot. I think when you actually explain and talk through whiteboard session, however you want to do it, but just basically talk through what that issue means and how it impacts the overall environment and not just what they're focused on. The other thing is also by taking a look and resolving this, also telling them how this actually will benefit them in the long run, how it could actually enable them to move faster, to focus on other things that they might be working on as well, and how it also is this small issue that is we're talking about, once fixed, could actually be compounded and be much larger from a value perspective and actually open up other doors for them. So it's not just focus on that one issue, but actually talk about the longer discussion around that item, how it plays into the rest of the world that they may or may not be focused on.
Absolutely. And Nick, to stay with you again for a minute, to give Liz a chance for her voice to kind of, to give her a little bit of a longer break. One of the things, one of the biggest challenges is when you discover a rogue system. The example that I think I've shared with both of you, I know I shared it with Liz, was, when the Move It breach happened, the organization that I was at the time, we had done a quick check of we did a check of our asset management system. We found all the servers that could potentially have it on it. We looked in our systems and said, yeah, no Move It. 3 days later, we get a call from one of the teams going, hey, our FTP isn't working out. Can you help us out? And we go, okay, well, what software are you using for FTP? And they go, Move It. And we're like, oh, really? And how did you get that set up? Oh, yeah, we just spun it up ourselves. So Deb S asked in the chat, and I'm going to ask it in a more general, but, how do you manage when a business unit has the ability to just do something on their own? They can spin up their own subscription on, in a cloud environment, or they can, they can sign up for some piece of software, some SaaS service or whatever. How do you handle identifying those rogue systems and getting a handle of that so that you don't have these exposure points that you end up not knowing about until something happens?
Hopefully, most are having discussions with various teams before that even happens to kind of talk about kind of visibility into things that they want to do and actually have that relationship with them so you can get some insight and talk about risk and whatnot. Not to stop them, but to at least understand what they're trying to do and if there's a better way of doing it, or at least put some guardrails around it where it can't hurt anything outside of that. I think the big thing on the identification of some of the rogue assets, and this depends on the stack and how monitoring's been set up and at the different layers and whatnot, is you're actually focusing on the areas that you are monitoring and you look at the anomalies. When something else pops up saying hello, then that should actually fire off an alert for the team to actually start taking a look at. Now, it takes a lot to get to that point, but even at a fundamental level, a lot of basic monitoring is going to give you that information when you have a neighbor that's on the same environment that pops up saying and starts looking for information and whatnot, even just to kind of figure out what the connection looks like. So being able to set up your monitoring to identify some of that is step one.
Yeah. So Liz, what tools, what strategies, what things are out there that are going to be the most effective for teams for that real time visibility that they need? You know, a new system got spun up. Like, what are some of the ways that they can identify and the tools and strategies they can use to identify those rogue systems when they enter into whatever you're kind of cross a barrier into something that you now have tracking in?
Sure. I'm going to put aside the obvious answer that's Axonius, because as field CISO, that's just an easy one. So I'm going to go think about some other ways. Because Axonius has not always been part of my stack. It
Right.
was in my last job. That's how I became a field CISO. And we do a great job, don't get me wrong, plugging in via API to, signal creators from all over the environment. So having a tool like Axonius, yeah, that's a pretty obvious answer, but there's some other ways. For one thing, you have process. I cannot say enough that it's people, processes, and technologies, right? Process is a big one. So it really, here you get into variability again, based on the size of the organization, the sort of cohesivity of the leadership. Sometimes you have centralized IT, centralized operations. I like that model simply because it does allow for leadership to have at least some kind of common taxonomy for the environment in terms of how they talk about it with one another, talk about it to senior management, talk about funding, et cetera. I think the centralized model works great. Also, it creates situations where rogue behavior becomes hopefully a problem that is brought into the technical organization by other non-technical parts of the organization. Like, I don't know what you do about an HR group that just goes rogue and spins up a server and installs Move It and doesn't tell anybody. I think the likelihood of that happening in a modern day on-prem data center is, kind of low, given how most organizations govern those environments. When you talk about the cloud, boy, that's not the story. So I think it has a lot to do with the monitoring. I think Nick said rightly a lot of things about monitoring. You can do things like look at signal from, like in AWS, if somebody's going to spin up a bunch of rogue stuff, somebody's paying for it. So if you do some billing monitoring, it can give you some picture of what's happening outside of your view. There are also, it's the cyber industry is full of tools for, kind of looking at various environments and coming up with alerts, right? So if you have a rogue system, ostensibly you're not going to have, kind of thinking about the worst case scenario, you're not going to have people who are installing your EDR or your EPP because they're doing something they're not supposed to be doing, maybe without a whole lot of expertise. So you can't necessarily rely on those as signal generators, but boy, do you have an IDS anywhere? Maybe if you're able to see a brand new system pop up, are you running like a ServiceNow Discover? That mid server should see a new system come up and report it into ServiceNow if that's a tool that you're using. There's all kinds of ways of getting to what I like to call detection in depth. Rogue systems can be difficult just because they are intrinsically off the map. So sometimes you have to investigate a little bit differently. Or, you could get a system like Axonius and have it done for you. It's up to you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Nick, to what extent can you leverage or should you be leveraging correlation between and really tracking based on identity where, hey, I saw this user use their network account, their credentials to log into something that we don't have in our kind of approved tech stack, is that or onto a system that we've never, like, we don't see that in our CMDB anywhere. Like, how can identity be a solution?
Yeah, if you're monitoring for it. If you're not looking at it, then no.
Right.
Everything generates an event. The question is where those events go. Are they going somewhere? Is anybody looking at it? So yes, if you're able to have eyes or something looking at the events happening and able to call out some of those anomalies, simple rules. Any type of SIM can or managed service or whatever can actually start to focus in on that and then escalate them into events of interest. Won't call them an incident, but just events of interest, so that other teams can kind of look at it and determine what's going on. But if you're not looking for some of that, if you don't have mechanisms in place for it, then no, it's not going to help you.
Right. So Liz, to kind of touching on that and touching on what we're talking about right now, should organizations be purely viewing identities as part of the attack surface, just the identity account information as part of the attack surface?
1,000%. I mean, if you look at, I don't know, possibly, I'm going to say a incendiary thing potentially, but if you look at just about every breach report, every exploit that's been hit that's hit the news in the last, let's call it forever, identity is part of, like the classic.
Well, I like how she puts that.
You're irreverent, but
I love how she put.
I'm going to use that Liz going forward. I like that.
Yeah. That's been stolen.
Credentials theft is like the cause of, on a low level, the cause of so much misery for individuals and for corporations and for all kinds of institutions, not just corporations. I don't mean to leave out, our federal government and school systems and what have you. But, there's no nice way of saying this. People are probably the entry point for all of our problems. Identities are attached to people. Non-human identities are even another whole layer of trouble as well. Of course, for the most part, because non-human identities don't work like humans, so you can't even really deprovision them. And if you don't know who owns them, you have no idea what they are. And after time, you have a credentialed account that has permissions to stuff that no one's changed a password on since the early 2000s, and who knows that password, who knows what that account really does, et cetera, et cetera. So you see, like, very simply put, yes, definitely part of the attack surface.
And I kind of asked a question that I knew the answer to because I wanted to be able to share my experience, bring my experience into this one of why identity is so important as an element of the attack surface is. It's so important, certainly in my experience, that you're monitoring how employees are using their identities, because I worked for an organization. I won't say which organization, but I worked for an organization that is local here in Houston that one of the things we would get every day is a report of compromised credentials. And what we ended up finding out was the number one place people were having compromised credentials, compromised network credentials occurring was on Grubhub, because they were using their network credentials on Grubhub, and so that they could track receipts and whatever they needed and what have you. And I'm on my work computer at the office, so I'll just use my corporate account. And that was the biggest element of the biggest exposure point for our attack surface. And I will tell you, it was at a critical infrastructure area where, it was at an organization responsible for critical infrastructure within the city, the Houston area. So it was not one of those where you want your identity to get compromised, because you could do things that would be very bad. So to me, it's like, it's so interesting when you talk to the IT teams or business leaders and you ask them, what do you consider the assets within our organization? And they don't think about identity. They don't think about cloud services. They're so focused on the endpoints. And that was why, Nick, I think one of the things you and I talked about was, okay, so, everything we've talked about is, oh my God, this attack surface is so hard to get a hold of. The attack surface is so large. The attack surface is so unknown. I know you and I talked about a way that can help make this easier to understand, easier to palate, easier to prioritize, easier to do everything. Can you talk a little bit about the approach that you can take and what you can focus on that will let you kind of step aside for a moment and say, yes, I need to be worried about the devices, but I need to be worried about devices in context of something else.
I mean, the easiest thing is have discussions with business owners to understand what's important to them. If I think
Right.
about discussions with HR or my commercial team and some of the ecosystems that they leverage, some of them might manage them, but the ecosystems in general that they're leveraging and how quickly that ecosystem can multiply and how the identities that are being used to extend to other services and whatnot. And it doesn't really matter what uh, the 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 area or the SaaS is. You can extend everything into something else to enrich information and to provide processes and whatnot. So, but that is kind of one area that I think um, is one area to kind of get into is having those discussions. I think the other thing is really talking about the data itself and where it's existing and how it got there and who manages it and how it's being manipulated and whatnot. So everything kind of comes back down to data.
Yeah, because I mean, data's got to be stored somewhere. It's going to exist somewhere, which is an a should be a identifiable, maybe not a known, but at least an identifiable asset of some sort. Either it's a cloud service or it's a server, or it's something living in your AWS or Azure environment. So like if you trace the data, I think that the point you're making is really good, which is if you trace the data through its flow, you're going to find assets, and you may find assets you didn't realize because, hey, they're storing it on this network share that nobody knew about that somebody set up because, or they're storing it out on Dropbox or Box or whatever because you followed where the data was going and was able to identify these things. So shifting gears a little bit, one of the things that is at kind of the forefront of attack surface management is dealing with the vulnerabilities that exist. When you identify your assets, you've got to then secure them. One of the biggest challenges I know the three of us have all faced is the sheer number of vulnerabilities that are identified in any organization. If you get over an organization of about 3 people, you're going to have thousands of vulnerabilities that you have to deal with. So, Liz, what's one of the how can organizations manage the vulnerability overload and properly prioritize what should and shouldn't be remediated, or the order in which things should be remediated?
Whew, that is the $64,000 question. I talk about this a lot, again, within the context of being
inflation hasn't raised that yet. Like, are we not above 64,000 now due to inflation?
Oh, well, with inflation, maybe it's 1,064,000.
Yeah.
I don't know. I hadn't thought about it. I'll have to do some math.
That was 5 minutes ago. What is it now?
It's probably a lot more than $64,000. Okay, now I've lost my train of thought. Okay, vulnerabilities. So
yeah.
This is within the field, the context of me being a field CISO for Axonius, I would be remiss if I didn't say we had come up with a way of doing this that's pretty great. But outside of having a dedicated system that kind of helps you manage your attack surface by allowing you to customize, right, your own environments, sort of prioritization score based on your risk profile, which is what we do with our exposures tool. Outside of having it comes down to understanding your environment. Even if you don't have a fulsome view because you have a wonderful system that helps you understand exactly what you have and put it in context, you can make some very educated guesses, right? So first of all, externally facing systems, real briefly, I would love to discuss the difference between a vulnerability and an exposure. An
Please.
exposure is something that will allow someone to actually intrude upon your environment. A vulnerability is something that is somewhere in your environment that isn't good. Not all vulnerabilities are exposures, and there are exposures that occur without there being a vulnerability present. For example, if you just have a more promiscuous set of firewall rules than is sensible, you have an exposure, right? So to me, prioritization starts with exposure management. That's a newer way of thinking about things. I think for a long time we scanned. We got lots and lots and lots of information back about all the things that are wrong, all the vulnerabilities. And then, in classic fashion, we made up a bunch of tickets and threw them over to IT and then wondered why nothing ever got patched. It's a labor-intensive process to manage thousands of tickets as an operational organization. It's no wonder that without any context or real understandable prioritization, historically, vulnerability management has been problematic. It is, in my opinion, a bit of a data problem that can be solved by looking with sort of criticality at your, and I'm going to say tier one systems and not say crown jewels. If you start with your tier one systems, if you start with your revenue generators, if you start with your most confidential data, which of course requires that you identify those systems, you're probably going to be okay, especially if you take care of those vulnerabilities within the context of the exposure to the outside world, right? So if you have a web-based application, and who doesn't these days, you're going to have external exposure on, say, your tier one systems. I would say start there, right?
Yeah, you bring up yeah, and you bring up a really great point. And it's about this difference between vulnerability and exposure, and it reminds me actually of what we kind of the approach we took at my last organization. We focused on, and if you're not familiar with, if anyone listening is not familiar with this, it's what's known as the KEV list, the known exploitable vulnerabilities. And what was really interesting was we ended up doing some analysis, some statistical analysis at my last organization, and I think we had upwards of 100,000 vulnerabilities, individual vulnerabilities within the organization. And we were able to determine that of that 100,000, only about 10 or 11% were actually on the known exploitable list. And when you can turn to your IT teams and go, hey, we know you've got 100,000. We really only want you to focus on this 10,000 over here. Don't worry about the 90,000 over here. Just really please focus on these 10,000. Makes the conversation a lot easier. We found that they actually said, oh, cool. That's awesome. Now I know what I need to focus on. And what they found out was of those 10,000, half of them were duplicates of each other. So if I dealt with one vulnerability, I got rid of, 50% of what I had. I got rid of, for every one that I dealt with, I got rid of two systems. That certainly makes the conversation that much easier. And it really does, because if you're patching a hole in the side of your ship, while the engine room is on fire, you might not be dealing with the right thing. Yes, one might sink, one might have be a problem. They're both problems, but one of them is going to have a more immediate impact on you, So I think you bring up a really great point. And, Nick, and I know you and I have talked about this before on previous webinars, but how do you take all of this, these ideas that are very technical, that are very focused on, these terms and these technical concepts that are not easily understood by non-technical people? How do you translate that into the language that the business will understand?
This is where sometimes it becomes a science for security professionals to be able to talk up and down the organization, because you need to get to the level with the engineers and help them understand why it's important to focus on this and whatnot. And then when you're actually getting up to the executive levels who are not going to really care about the technical details as to why you're doing this and whatnot, but really what does it mean for the services and how a vulnerability, if exploited in the right situation, could impact customers, could impact the business, could impact the brand, the reputation, and you could be facing additional scrutiny, if especially if there's a data exposure with regulators, if you're a global company and whatnot. So there's a lot of different things that you could add into the risk management discussion with executives that they would be able to understand how material a vulnerability, if not managed correctly, could be for the business.
Absolutely. So since I asked Liz a $64,000 question, I'm going to ask you one, Nick, because it just came in and I think it's a really good one. And mainly because I have to get back at you for something, I'm sure. I don't know what yet, but I'll figure it out later. What do you do when the application owner and the system owner are not the same person or not the same party? Who is responsible then for addressing the vulnerabilities? And how do you bridge the gap between those two?
Get both of them in a room and talk through it. At the point, it doesn't matter. Hope for the best. Yeah. I mean, you get whoever the stakeholders are in the room that can talk through it and to get an understanding of why it is important to take it seriously. So I honestly don't worry about the ownership aspect of it. I worry about who's the stakeholders that I need to influence to take an action.
Yeah, that makes a whole lot of sense. So we're getting towards the end. I want to there's one topic I want to focus on before we go to questions, and that's that is, what do you do? And I'll start with you, Liz. But what do you do when you have to secure your attack surface and your attack surface is managed, maintained, provided by a third party? You know, you've got a third party source that you're working with. How do you work with them to make sure your attack surface is properly maintained?
That's a tough one. God, I hate to say it depends, but it does depend. First of all, it depends on the kind of engagement that you have with that third party. If you're talking an MSP that's managing your systems for you, for instance, or providing a service on a system that is, they have their own, for instance, Axonius, and they're providing you with services based on that, then it becomes, I guess you could look at a SOC 2.
Right.
Hopefully you have a better relationship with that MSP than, just a SOC 2. Hopefully you get to know sort of their common practices. There's a little bit, I think, of assessment of the technical skill of the team. That definitely is part of your due diligence when you're looking for a provider. And that's if you're talking about sort of a service being provided by an MSP. When you get into like SaaS providers, I don't think we as an industry have figured out quite exactly how to assess our SaaS providers. I think it's one of those areas where maybe to go off of the theme for B-Side San Francisco this year, here be dragons. I think we have not quite gotten to the place where we as an industry have decided that we're going to start looking at how our SaaS providers actually secure their environments and how they interface with one another. I'm essentially referring to third-party risk in that. That is a very important question to answer, and I don't think I'm going to be able to answer it by myself right now. For myself, absolutely. I do try, however, to make sure that the basics are taken care of, right? So you can use a tool, you can use, I think this is an area where if you don't have a tool, you're looking at dark magic to monitor, things like shadow SaaS. So at least you have visibility into what your end users are doing. That's hopefully going to get, kind of the easy stuff off your plate, not let them in easily. Hopefully you're looking at using multi-factor, especially for confidential transactions. Hopefully you're looking at driving everything through single sign-on, so you at least have some knowledge of who's using what via your IDP, and you can do some posture assessment. These are the things that we have available to us today. But I think that area of practice, especially around real SaaS management, which to me is managing the sort of health and state of the data, I think that is an emerging area where there are some providers that are trying to tackle that. That's not a great answer. I'm sorry. I don't have any answers for the audience today. I've got more questions maybe.
So I can give you kind of an idea. So I have relationships with my customers' CISOs because I get the same questions just on the reverse. And I also have the relationships with the services I use. And it does come down to getting confidence in the services and how the data is being managed and the basic processes are in place. Yes, you can rely on SOC 2 Type 2, you can rely on all the different credentials, but that's on paper. What's actually really going on in the environment, and can you get down to an understanding that your data is actually being protected as it should be, as you would protect it. So I have regular discussions with many of my customers' CISOs just to get that, to provide confidence that we are doing what we say we're doing as part of our contractual agreements, but also back it up with the processes to a certain extent. Can't give them all the details, but at least a comfort level to know that once the data is in the environment, it's being protected as they would if they were protected in their own environment.
And I think there's also for talking about, just really quickly, sorry, for actually doing assurance testing on your providers. I think I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, if you have a red team, could point your red team at your provider. However, very often you have to look at your contract because that's often a no-no. So there's ways of
your contract. Please talk to legal before you do that.
Yes, absolutely.
None of us here are lawyers, and we're not providing any legal advice. I've given that disclaimer.
Yes,
okay, so
but you know what I'm saying, assurance.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and there are certainly steps you can take. So, okay, so we've got a couple questions that have come in. I'm gonna do this in kind of a lightning round format a little bit because I don't think that they are going to require super long drawn out questions or answers. But the first question that came in: what's the first step if you've never formally mapped your attack surface? Nick?
First step, start talking to people to figure out what's out there and what do they know, and then kind of branch off that, especially with key business stakeholders and whatnot. But take a look at your systems and what information's in there and try to piece together what the gaps are.
Liz, from your perspective, what would you give as the kind of the first step if you've never formally mapped your attack surface?
I would say I kind of agree with Nick. Like if you don't have anything, figure out what you do have. Start trying to figure out what it takes to pull together just a basic inventory. If you have an asset inventory system, I would start doing some validation of the data to make sure that you have some idea of how accurate it is. Hopefully you have something to begin with. If you don't, I would say that's a gut check. And I would go immediately myself, again, in the context of being field CISO for Axonius and having been a customer, and it doesn't have to be Axonius. Don't tell them I said that, but there are other tools on the market that might fit, your budget, your circumstance better. Making an investment in asset management is, I think, the first step in just about everything we do. Cyber is a data problem. If you don't have data, you've got a problem.
Absolutely. So, okay, next question that came in. How do you budget for attack surface management investments without a crisis to justify them?
Oh, I don't have a good answer for that one. I mean, when I put a budget together, I try not to focus in on, again, a specific tool or technology. I focus on how I'm actually going to mitigate a risk. So I'll put the budget around that risk topic. And then, because it might be one or two pieces that I have to put together, it may not just be one thing. So I really focus that. I focus on the risk itself because as I'm presenting that to management, again, the technology, they're not too interested in. They want to know what I'm doing to mitigate the risk.
Absolutely. And then Liz, from your experience, how do you budget? How do you respond when you hear a customer or you hear somebody say, well, but I can't budget for this. I don't have, there's nothing pushing me, like forcing me to have to do this. There hasn't been a crisis. There isn't any reason. Why should I do, how do I can't budget for this. How do you coach them through that?
Well, I mean, I suppose thinking you don't have the budget for asset management or thinking you don't have the budget for security and relying instead on a crisis to get you the budget, I think that's a little bit like, um, well, I think it's something like, once the horse has left the barn, left the town, run to and then the barn's burned down, then you're going to close the door. That seems a little backward. To me, it all comes down to, your risk profile and how you're going to address that strategically. Ideally, when you run a program, you're not necessarily just looking at tools. You are looking at your attack surface. For instance, you're looking at, your inherent risk, and then the controls you have in place, and your residual risk. And does that residual risk actually equate to a level of protection that is in keeping with your strategic goals? Those strategic goals definitely need to go back to your business stakeholders, because they're the ones that are going to say, yes, your strategy maps to where we're taking this company. Yes, your strategy maps the level of funding that we expect. There are tolerances within that generally. If you come and say, I think I need $1 million for my program, but you really need 10, you're probably going to be pretty unpopular. But with practice, and it does take a little time, especially if you're new to an organization, it may take you a few months to a couple of years, frankly, to find that strategic foothold. But in general, using crises to determine your budget, not great. Not great. Should be counseled against. 1 star. Would not recommend.
Yeah, and just also be
Absolutely.
clear, if you're going through a crisis, you're not asking for it, you're just getting it, and then you figure out how to pay for it later.
There
Yeah.
is that, but I still would recommend you not wait for a crisis. But it is
Yes.
one tricky way to get money. Nice one, Nick.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Well, so as we wrap up, I'm going to put up our standard poll questions, but I'm going to start. Nick, can you kind of final thoughts? What do you want to leave the audience with in terms of attack surface management?
Yeah, I'll go back to what Liz said earlier on. Focus on the processes, focus on your relationship, talk to people, try to figure out what they think is in their world that you're not aware of that actually makes up your attack surface.
Okay. And then Liz, final thoughts from you.
I think again, the discussion of the exposure versus the vulnerability and the importance of asset management. I think those would be the 2 things I would take away. Don't necessarily spend a lot of time trying to remediate all your vulnerabilities. Try to find context. Start with your exposures, your areas of worst exposure. Looking outside in. There's a few different ways to do that, and then definitely make sure that you are setting the stage for, maybe this is my 3rd thing, make sure you're setting the stage for the funding that you need by telling the story of sort of that inherent risk, residual risk, and how you are managing your attack surface in such a way that every dollar spent is actually doing some good for you strategically and tactically.
Yeah, and I think both of you make really great points. I think that for me, the overarching thing about attack surface management is we have to be thinking about attack surface management more holistically than we typically have. It is not your traditional systems only focus that it maybe has been. It's got to be everything anywhere that an attack can occur. So it's identity, it's cloud, it's everything. But when to Nick, to your point as well, when you bring it to the data and you really start focusing on the data, that will help you identify those systems, and then you can go protect those systems. But that it doesn't need to be like, it's not yes, it may sound overwhelming, it may seem overwhelming, but at the end of the day, it is about finding those systems that have the most sensitive information, the most high value, to your organization, and doing everything you can to protect those systems from attack. So, thank you both so much for being here. Liz, if people want to learn more about Axonius, if they want to speak further with you, how can they get in touch with you?
Sure. Well, I'm very easy to find on LinkedIn, Liz Morton. I'm the only person named Liz Morton that works for Axonius. Or you can come to our website. We just relaunched a pretty spectacular website with lots of actually pretty interesting white papers and just stories of what we do, how our customers use our tool, etc. That's www.axonius.com.
And for those of you who haven't, we've got a number of handouts that Axonius has provided that are in the handout section that you can download to review. Nick, thank you so much for being here. Where can people find you?
I don't know, everywhere, LinkedIn.
Fair enough.
I'm not sure if I want to
Nick
be
is-
found sometimes.
If anyone wants to know
LinkedIn.
where Nick is, you can come to me, and for a certain price, I might reveal how to get in touch with Nick. So
I'll be at
thank you
InfoSec
both
World.
for
That's one
being
place
here.
you can find me.
InfoSec World, yes. Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Liz. Thank you all for attending. Hope everyone has a great rest of the day today, rest of your week, upcoming weekend. We'll see you guys again on another one of these. Follow us on LinkedIn, scworld.com. And thank you all for being here.
Thanks, Dustin.
Thanks, Dustin.